The sound of metal cutting through metal echoed across the waterfront like a gunshot. I stood at my kitchen window, watching in disbelief as Richard Thompson, my HOA board member, held bolt cutters against my private gate lock. His locksmith stood beside him, tools in hand, ready to break into my property. "You cannot do this," I shouted through the window, my voice cracking with rage and disbelief. Richard looked up at me with a smug grin that made my blood boil. "Watch me," he called back, raising the bolt cutters higher. This was not some neighborhood dispute about grass height or mailbox colors. This was a grown man attempting to steal access to my private dock so he could store his boat for free. For 6 months, he had harassed me, threatened me, and tried to destroy my peace of mind. But as I reached for my phone to dial 911, I realized something important. Richard Thompson had no idea what he was about to face. 3 years ago, I found my slice of heaven on Lakeside Drive. The house was not the biggest or the fanciest in the neighborhood, but it had something that made my heart race the moment I saw it. A private dock with direct water access, protected by a secure gate that opened onto the most beautiful stretch of Crystal Lake I had ever seen. I remember standing on that dock during my first viewing, watching the morning mist dance across the water. The realtor, a kind woman named Sarah, explained that the previous owner had installed the gate system to protect the dock from unauthorized use. The access was written into the property deed, she assured me, completely private and legally protected. "This is it," I whispered to myself, already imagining my morning coffee routine on the wooden planks, watching boats glide peacefully across the lake. The purchase process was smooth. I paid extra for a professional survey to confirm the property boundaries and dock access rights. Every document, every legal paper, every piece of evidence showed the same thing. The dock was mine. The gate was mine. The access was mine alone. When I moved in that September, the neighborhood welcomed me with open arms. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, brought homemade cookies and stories about the community. The mailman, Joe, stopped to chat about the best fishing spots on the lake. Even the HOA seemed reasonable during my first few meetings. The Lakeside Community Association met monthly at the community center, a small building near the main entrance. The board consisted of 5 members, all longtime residents who seemed genuinely interested in maintaining property values and community harmony. The president, Margaret Willis, ran efficient meetings and kept discussions focused on practical matters like snow removal and landscaping contracts. That was where I first met Richard Thompson. Richard was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that politicians practice in mirrors. He had served on the HOA board for over a decade, Margaret explained, and owned one of the larger homes on the lake. During my first meeting, he approached me with what seemed like genuine neighborly interest. "So you are the new owner of the old Peterson place," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Beautiful property. That dock access is really something special." "Thank you," I replied, feeling proud of my new home. "I feel very lucky to have found it." "Yes, that private gate setup is quite unique in our community," Richard continued, his eyes studying my face carefully. "Not many properties have that level of exclusivity." Something in his tone made me pause, but I dismissed it as curiosity. After all, he was just being friendly, right? Over the following months, Richard made a habit of walking past my property during his evening strolls. He would always wave and smile, sometimes stopping to comment on my landscaping or ask about my dock maintenance routine. His questions seemed innocent enough at first. "How often do you use the dock?" he would ask. "Do you ever have trouble with the gate mechanism?" I answered politely, thinking these were normal neighbor conversations. But as autumn turned to winter, Richard's questions became more specific and frequent. He wanted to know about my work schedule, my travel plans, and whether I ever allowed other people to use my dock. "It seems like such a waste," he said one December evening, finding me clearing snow from my walkway. "A beautiful dock like that, sitting empty most of the time." That comment struck me as odd, but I laughed it off. "I use it plenty during the warmer months," I said, "and it is nice to have my own private space." Richard nodded, but something in his expression had changed. The friendly neighbor mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something calculating underneath. "Private space," he repeated slowly. "Yes, I suppose that is important to some people." As winter deepened and the lake froze over, I noticed Richard walking past my property more frequently. He would pause at my gate, sometimes for several minutes, studying the lock mechanism and the fence line. When he spotted me watching from my window, he would wave and continue his walk as if nothing had happened. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid. Richard was just a curious neighbor, interested in property features and community development. But deep down, a nagging feeling told me that something was not right. That feeling would prove to be absolutely correct. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the return of boating season. I spent my first warm weekend cleaning and preparing my dock, excited to finally use my waterfront paradise the way I had always dreamed. The gate opened smoothly, the dock boards were solid and secure, and the view across Crystal Lake was absolutely breathtaking. I was tightening the cleats on my dock when I heard footsteps approaching on the gravel path. Richard appeared at my gate, dressed in khaki pants and a polo shirt, looking every inch the successful suburban retiree. But there was something different about his demeanor today. The friendly neighbor act had been replaced by something more businesslike and determined. "Good morning," he called out, his voice carrying an unusual formality. "I hope you have a few minutes to chat. There is something important we need to discuss." I paused in my work, already sensing that this conversation was not going to be pleasant. "Of course," I replied, walking over to the gate. "What can I help you with?" Richard cleared his throat and pulled out a small notebook, as if he had prepared talking points for this encounter. "I have been thinking about our community resources and how we can better utilize them for everyone's benefit," he began. "Your dock access represents a significant opportunity for improved community cooperation." The formal language set off alarm bells in my head. "I am sorry," I said slowly, "but I am not sure what you mean." "What I mean," Richard continued, his voice gaining confidence, "is that I need a copy of your gate key." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him in disbelief, certain that I had misunderstood. "Excuse me." "Your gate key," he repeated, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "I need access to this dock area for my boat storage and maintenance needs. My property does not have direct water access, and this would solve that problem very efficiently." I felt my heart rate increase as the full implications of his request sank in. "Richard, this is my private property. The dock access is written into my deed. I cannot just give you a key to my private gate." His expression hardened slightly, but he maintained his reasonable tone. "I understand your position, but I think you are missing the bigger picture here. I have been a member of this community for over 15 years. I have contributed significantly to property values and community development. My boat storage needs are temporary and reasonable." "Temporary?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "How temporary are we talking about?" "Well, that depends on several factors," Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. "The important thing is that we find a solution that works for everyone. I am not asking for anything unreasonable here." I took a deep breath, trying to process what I was hearing. "Richard, with all due respect, you are asking me to give you unlimited access to my private property. That is not reasonable. That is not even legal." The mask slipped then, just for a moment. Richard's friendly expression twisted into something uglier, more entitled. "Legal," he said, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "Let me tell you what is legal. I am a board member of this HOA. I have the authority to investigate and address violations of our community standards." "What violations?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That remains to be determined," Richard replied, his smile returning but carrying no warmth. "I have noticed several potential issues with your property maintenance and compliance with community guidelines. Your gate installation, for example, was never properly approved by the Architectural Review Committee." I felt the blood drain from my face. "I have all the documentation from when I purchased the property. The gate was installed by the previous owner and approved years ago." "Documentation can be interpreted in different ways," Richard said, pulling out his phone and taking a photo of my gate. "The board takes community compliance very seriously. We have tools at our disposal to address residents who refuse to cooperate with reasonable requests." The threat was clear, even wrapped in his polite language. I stood there, gripping the gate handle, as Richard continued his intimidation campaign. "I am not asking for much," he said, his voice returning to its fake reasonable tone. "Just a copy of your key so I can access the dock when needed. It is a simple solution that avoids any complications." "No," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "The answer is no, Richard. This is my private property, and I will not be giving you or anyone else unauthorized access." Richard's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might lose his composure entirely. Instead, he closed his notebook with a sharp snap and stepped back from the gate. "I hope you reconsider," he said, his voice now carrying unmistakable menace. "For your own sake, I really hope you reconsider." As he walked away, I stood frozen at my gate, watching his retreating figure and trying to process what had just happened. My peaceful waterfront paradise had just been invaded by a man who believed his position on the HOA board gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. I had no idea that this was just the beginning. The first violation notice arrived 3 days later. I found it tucked into my mailbox, an official-looking document on HOA letterhead accusing me of unauthorized landscaping modifications and failure to maintain community aesthetic standards. The specific complaint focused on the small garden I had planted near my dock gate, claiming it violated setback requirements and color scheme guidelines. I read the notice twice, my hands shaking with anger and disbelief. The garden consisted of 3 small bushes and a handful of flowers, identical to landscaping I had seen throughout the neighborhood. But there it was, in black and white, demanding immediate corrective action and threatening fines for noncompliance. This was Richard's opening move, and we both knew it. I spent that evening researching HOA regulations and community guidelines, cross-referencing every rule and requirement I could find. The landscaping complaint was baseless, but fighting it would require time, energy, and potentially legal fees. Richard was betting that I would cave under pressure rather than endure a prolonged battle. He was wrong. The second notice arrived the following week, this time complaining about my excessive dock maintenance activities and claiming that my weekend cleaning routine created noise violations. The third notice focused on my garbage can placement, despite the fact that I followed the exact same schedule and positioning as every other house on the street. Each violation notice followed the same pattern: technical language, vague accusations, and threats of escalating penalties. Richard was using his position on the board to weaponize every rule and regulation against me, creating a paper trail of harassment disguised as legitimate community oversight. But the worst part was not the notices themselves. It was the whisper campaign that accompanied them. I began noticing subtle changes in my neighbor's behavior. Mrs. Peterson still waved hello, but our conversations became shorter and more awkward. Joe the mailman started avoiding eye contact during his deliveries. At the grocery store, I overheard two women from my neighborhood discussing that difficult new resident who refuses to cooperate with the HOA. Richard had been busy spreading his version of events, painting me as an uncooperative troublemaker who threatened community harmony. He was particularly effective at twisting my refusal to give him my gate key into a story about selfishness and antisocial behavior. "She has this beautiful dock that she barely uses," I heard him telling a group of neighbors at the community center. When I asked about shared access for emergency situations, she became very hostile and uncooperative. Emergency situations. The man was rewriting history, transforming his demand for free boat storage into a reasonable request for community safety access. I tried to defend myself, but Richard's 15-year reputation in the community gave him significant credibility. My explanations about private property rights and legal documentation sounded defensive and selfish compared to his smooth talk about community cooperation and shared resources. The harassment campaign intensified throughout the summer. Richard began driving past my house at unusual hours, sometimes slowing down to take photos of my property. He would position himself at community events to monitor my interactions with other neighbors, always ready to intercept conversations and steer them toward his narrative. The most disturbing incident happened on a Tuesday evening in July. I was inside my house, catching up on work emails, when I heard the distinctive sound of footsteps on gravel. I looked out my window and saw Richard standing directly in front of my gate, testing the lock mechanism with his hands. He was not being subtle about it. He pulled on the gate handle, examined the lock housing, and even pressed his face against the fence slats to get a better view of my dock area. When he spotted me watching from my window, he did not look embarrassed or apologetic. Instead, he stared back at me with open hostility, as if I was the one trespassing on his property. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called a local security company and arranged for the installation of a comprehensive camera system. If Richard wanted to escalate this conflict, I would be ready with evidence of his harassment and intimidation tactics. The cameras would cover my gate, my dock, and the entire perimeter of my property. The installation took place the following weekend, and I made sure the cameras were visible from the street. I wanted Richard to know that he was being watched, that his harassment campaign was being documented, and that I was prepared to fight back. The cameras captured more than I expected. Within a week, I had footage of Richard testing my gate lock on 3 separate occasions, always when he thought I was not home. I had recordings of him taking detailed photos of my property from multiple angles. Most importantly, I had evidence of him instructing other neighbors to file complaints about my noncompliance with community standards. Richard Thompson thought he could intimidate me into submission through bureaucratic warfare and social isolation, but he had made a critical error in judgment. He had chosen to fight someone who was willing to fight back. The community center had never seen a crowd like this. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about the emergency HOA meeting called to address ongoing compliance issues and community access concerns. Translation: Richard had finally decided to make his power play official. I arrived 30 minutes early, armed with a thick folder of documentation and a laptop loaded with security camera footage. The parking lot was already half full, with neighbors streaming toward the building in small groups, their conversations hushed but intense. Inside, the usual setup of folding chairs in neat rows had been expanded to accommodate what looked like half the neighborhood. Richard stood near the front, dressed in a dark suit that made him look more like a lawyer than a retired neighbor. He was working the crowd, shaking hands and speaking in low, serious tones about community standards and property rights responsibilities. Margaret Willis, the HOA president, looked uncomfortable as she prepared for what was clearly going to be a contentious meeting. The other board members whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing in my direction, with expressions ranging from curious to hostile. "Good evening, everyone," Margaret began, her voice carrying a nervous tremor. "We are here tonight to address some concerns that have been raised regarding property access and community compliance. Richard Thompson has requested time to present his findings and recommendations." Richard stood up, his confident smile sweeping across the packed room. "Thank you, Margaret, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to address this important community issue." He clicked a remote, and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on the portable screen behind him. The first slide showed a photo of my gate, with the title Community Access and Safety Concerns. "As many of you know," Richard continued, "our community has always been built on principles of cooperation and shared responsibility. We help each other. We look out for each other. We work together to maintain the property values and quality of life that make Lakeside Drive such a special place to live." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Richard had chosen his opening carefully, appealing to community values that everyone could support. "However," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "we have a situation that threatens these fundamental principles. One of our residents has chosen to prioritize personal convenience over community safety and cooperation." The next slide showed a diagram of my property, with the dock access highlighted in red. "This resident has exclusive access to valuable waterfront resources that could serve the entire community in emergency situations. When approached about reasonable access sharing, this resident became hostile and uncooperative." I felt my blood pressure rising as Richard painted his twisted version of events. According to his presentation, I was a selfish newcomer who refused to contribute to community welfare. His demand for my gate key had been transformed into a reasonable request for emergency access that I had rejected out of spite. "Furthermore," Richard continued, "this resident has consistently violated community standards regarding property maintenance, noise levels, and architectural compliance. Despite multiple attempts at cooperative resolution, these issues remain unaddressed." The slideshow continued with photos of my property, each one carefully selected to support Richard's narrative. My small garden looked excessive from certain angles. My weekend dock maintenance appeared disruptive when photographed during particularly busy moments. Even my security cameras were presented as antisocial surveillance that made neighbors uncomfortable. By the time Richard finished his presentation, the room was buzzing with concerned whispers. He had masterfully repositioned himself as a reasonable community leader dealing with a difficult and uncooperative resident. I call on this board, Richard concluded, to take action necessary to ensure community standards are maintained and that all residents contribute equally to our shared welfare. Margaret looked uncomfortable as she turned to me. Would you like to respond to these concerns? I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady. Yes, I would. I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector, replacing Richard's slides with my own presentation. The first image showed my property deed, with the dock access rights clearly highlighted in legal language. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, what you just heard was a very creative interpretation of events. Let me show you what actually happened. I clicked to the next slide, showing Richard's violation notices alongside photos of identical features throughout the neighborhood. These are the harassment documents I have received over the past 6 months. Each complaint focuses on property features that are identical to those found on dozens of other homes in our community. The room grew quiet as I presented my evidence methodically and calmly. I showed the legal documentation proving my exclusive dock access rights. I displayed screenshots of my security cameras showing Richard testing my gate lock on multiple occasions. I presented recordings of him instructing other neighbors to file complaints about my property. The real issue, I continued, is not community access or safety concerns. The real issue is that Richard Thompson wants free access to my private dock so he can store his boat without paying for proper marina facilities. The room erupted in surprised murmurs as the truth finally came to light. Richard's face had gone pale, his confident smile replaced by something much more desperate. Furthermore, I said, clicking to video footage of Richard at my gate, this is what actual harassment looks like. This is someone attempting to intimidate a neighbor into surrendering their legal property rights. The video showed Richard testing my lock, taking photos of my property, and gesturing angrily toward my house during his late-night visits. The evidence was undeniable and damning. Margaret called for order as the room dissolved into shocked conversations. Richard stood up, his composure finally cracking under the weight of exposure. "This is character assassination," he shouted, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "I have served this community faithfully for 15 years. I will not be slandered by someone who refuses to be a good neighbor." But the damage was done. The community had seen the evidence. They had heard the truth, and they were not happy about being manipulated. Richard Thompson's reign of intimidation was about to come to an end. I woke up that Saturday morning to the sound of voices outside my window. At first, I thought it might be early morning joggers or dog walkers, but something about the tone made me pause. These voices carried an urgency that immediately put me on alert. I slipped on my robe and moved to the kitchen window, the one that provided the best view of my gate and dock area. What I saw made my blood run cold. Richard Thompson stood at my gate with another man I did not recognize. The stranger was older, wearing work clothes and carrying a large toolbox. Between them lay a set of bolt cutters, their metal blades gleaming in the morning sunlight like weapons of destruction. But it was the third person that made my heart race. Richard had brought someone with him who was clearly a locksmith, complete with professional equipment, and a van parked on the street. This was not a casual visit or an impulsive decision. This was a planned assault on my property. I grabbed my phone and started recording as Richard gestured toward my gate, apparently giving instructions to his accomplices. His voice carried across the water, confident and commanding. "The board meeting made it clear that community access is a priority," he was saying. "This gate represents a barrier to proper emergency response and community resource utilization. I opened my window and called out, "Richard, what are you doing?" He looked up at me with that same smug expression I had come to despise. "Good morning," he replied, his voice carrying mock politeness. "We are here to resolve the access issue once and for all." "You cannot touch my gate," I said, my voice rising with panic and fury. "This is private property. What you are planning is breaking and entering." Richard pulled out a folded document and held it up for me to see. "Actually, the board has voted to override your property restrictions in the interest of community safety. This is completely legal and authorized." I knew he was lying. The board had no such authority, and even if they did, proper legal procedures would require written notice and opportunities for appeal. But Richard was gambling that I would be too intimidated to resist his fake authority. "I am calling the police," I shouted, already dialing 911 on my phone. "Go ahead," Richard replied, his confidence apparently unshaken. "I have documentation showing full board approval for this action. The police will support community safety over individual selfishness." The locksmith, meanwhile, had been examining my gate mechanism and looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He stepped back from the gate and spoke quietly to Richard, but I could not hear their conversation from my window. 911, what is your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice came through my phone. "Someone is trying to break into my property," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. "They have bolt cutters and are threatening to cut my gate lock." As I provided my address and details to the dispatcher, I watched Richard's demeanor begin to change. The locksmith was shaking his head and backing away from the gate, clearly unwilling to participate in what was obviously illegal activity. "Sir," the locksmith said, loud enough for me to hear, "I cannot help you access property that does not belong to you. This could be a criminal matter." Richard's facade began to crack. "I told you I have board authorization. This is a community access issue." "That is not how property law works," the locksmith replied, packing up his equipment. "You need to resolve this through proper legal channels." As the locksmith walked back to his van, Richard was left standing at my gate with just the bolt cutters and his rapidly dissolving confidence. The plan was falling apart, and his desperation was becoming more apparent by the minute. "Richard," I called from my window, "the police are on their way. I suggest you step away from my property." Instead of retreating, Richard picked up the bolt cutters and approached my gate with renewed determination. "I am not leaving until this access issue is resolved," he shouted. "This community has been patient with your selfishness for too long." He positioned the bolt cutters against my lock and began to apply pressure. The metal groaned under the strain, and I realized that Richard had passed the point of no return. He was going to attempt to break into my property regardless of the legal consequences. "Stop!" I screamed, running outside in my robe and slippers. "You are committing a crime." Richard looked up at me with wild eyes, his carefully maintained composure completely gone. "This is not a crime," he snarled. "This is justice. You think you can hide behind your property rights while the rest of us follow community standards." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Richard heard them too, and I watched his face transform from angry determination to panicked realization. "The police are here," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I suggest you put down those bolt cutters and prepare to explain yourself." Richard stood frozen at my gate, bolt cutters still in his hands, as the first police cruiser rounded the corner onto our street. The confrontation that had been building for months was finally about to reach its conclusion. and Richard Thompson was about to learn that there are consequences for threatening people who refuse to back down. The police cruiser came to a stop directly in front of my property, its presence immediately transforming the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Officer Martinez, a professional-looking woman in her 30s, stepped out of the vehicle with the calm authority that comes from years of handling domestic disputes and neighborhood conflicts. Richard immediately dropped the bolt cutters and stepped back from my gate, his demeanor shifting from aggressive determination to nervous charm. "Officer, thank goodness you are here," he said, his voice carrying that practiced tone of reasonable authority. "We have a community safety situation that requires immediate resolution." Officer Martinez looked at the bolt cutters on the ground, then at Richard, then at me standing in my robe by my front door. "Sir, I need you to step away from the gate and keep your hands where I can see them," she said firmly. "Of course, officer," Richard replied, raising his hand slightly. "I am Richard Thompson, a member of the HOA board. We are here on official community business." Officer Martinez was not impressed by his credentials. "Ma'am," she said, addressing me directly, "are you the property owner who called about someone attempting to break into your gate?" "Yes, that is correct," I replied, holding up my phone which was still recording the entire encounter. "I have video evidence of the attempted break-in and months of harassment leading up to this incident." The officer's expression grew more serious as she assessed the situation. "Sir, what is your relationship to this property?" Richard straightened up, clearly believing that his position would carry weight with law enforcement. "I am a longtime resident and HOA board member. This property has exclusive access to community waterfront resources, which creates safety and compliance issues for our neighborhood." "That does not answer my question," Officer Martinez replied firmly. "Do you have any legal ownership or access rights to this property?" "Well, not directly," Richard admitted, "but the board has voted to address access restrictions that impact community welfare." A second police cruiser arrived, and Officer Johnson, a tall man with graying hair, joined the conversation. Officer Martinez quickly briefed him on the situation while I retrieved my folder of documentation from inside my house. "Officers," I said, returning with my evidence, "I have extensive documentation of this man's harassment campaign against me, including violation notices, security camera footage, and records of his repeated attempts to force me to give him access to my private property." Officer Johnson examined my property deed, while Officer Martinez reviewed the violation notices. "Mr. Thompson," Officer Johnson said, "can you show me the board resolution authorizing you to cut this resident's gate lock?" Richard's face went pale as he realized his bluff was being called. "The resolution is, it was a verbal agreement reached during our emergency session," he stammered. "So you have no written authorization?" Officer Martinez asked. "The urgency of the situation required immediate action," Richard replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sir," Officer Johnson said, "attempting to cut someone's gate lock without proper authorization is breaking and entering. The bolt cutters on the ground suggest you were preparing to commit a crime." "This is ridiculous," Richard exploded, his composure finally breaking completely. "I have lived in this community for 15 years. I have contributed more to property values and community development than this woman ever will. My needs are reasonable and justified." Officer Martinez stepped forward, her hand moving toward her handcuffs. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to calm down and listen carefully. You are being detained for investigation of attempted breaking and entering." "You cannot arrest me," Richard shouted, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "I am a board member. I have rights. This woman is the problem, not me." "Sir, you have the right to remain silent," Officer Martinez began, but Richard continued his tirade. "This is harassment of a community leader," he screamed as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I will have your badges for this. I know people. I have connections." The transformation was remarkable. In the span of 10 minutes, Richard had gone from confident authority figure to desperate criminal suspect. His threats and bluster only made his situation worse as neighbors began emerging from their homes to witness the spectacle. Mrs. Peterson stood on her porch, her hand over her mouth in shock. Joe the mailman had stopped his rounds to watch the drama unfold. Other neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering and pointing as Richard was led toward the police cruiser. "Officers," I said, "I have months of security footage showing this man testing my gate lock, taking photos of my property, and instructing other neighbors to file false complaints against me. This was not an impulsive action. This was a planned campaign of harassment and intimidation." Officer Johnson nodded as he reviewed my documentation. "We will need copies of all this evidence for our report. Mr. Thompson is being arrested for attempted breaking and entering, harassment, and intimidation." As Richard was placed in the back of the police cruiser, he made one final desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. "This is not over," he shouted through the window. "The community will not stand for this kind of selfishness." But the community had already seen enough. The neighbors who had gathered to watch were not showing support for Richard. They were showing shock and embarrassment at his behavior. The man they had trusted to represent their interests had revealed himself to be a bully and a criminal. Officer Martinez handed me her business card. "We will need you to come to the station later today to provide a formal statement. Make sure you bring all your documentation and video evidence." As the police cruisers pulled away with Richard in custody, I stood in my driveway, still wearing my robe, trying to process what had just happened. 6 months of harassment, intimidation, and threats had finally ended with justice being served. The gate to my private dock remained secure, and Richard Thompson was no longer a threat to my peace of mind. The silence that followed Richard's arrest was profound. For the first time in months, I stood in my driveway without the weight of constant harassment pressing down on my shoulders. The morning sun felt warmer, the lake breeze smelled sweeter, and even the sound of my gate's lock mechanism seemed more secure and reassuring. Within hours, news of Richard's arrest had spread throughout the neighborhood. My phone began ringing with calls from neighbors who wanted to apologize, to explain, and to share their own stories of Richard's intimidation tactics. Apparently, I had not been his only victim. Mrs. Peterson was the first to visit, bringing another batch of homemade cookies and a heartfelt apology. "I should have known something was wrong," she said, shaking her head sadly. "Richard always seemed so reasonable, so concerned about community standards. I never imagined he was harassing you." "He was very convincing," I replied, grateful for her honesty. "He made it seem like I was the problem, like I was being selfish and uncooperative." "Well, the whole neighborhood knows the truth now," she said firmly. "What he did was completely unacceptable. Breaking into someone's property, threatening them, lying about board authority. It is shameful." Over the following days, more neighbors came forward with their own experiences. Richard had used his board position to bully several residents into compliance with his personal preferences. He had filed false complaints against anyone who questioned his authority. He had even threatened some neighbors with property value impacts if they did not support his positions. The HOA board held an emergency meeting 3 days after Richard's arrest. Margaret Willis, clearly embarrassed by the situation, addressed the packed community center with genuine remorse. "We owe our community, and especially our neighbor who was targeted by this harassment, a sincere apology," she said. Richard Thompson acted without board authorization and used his position to pursue personal interests at the expense of community welfare. The board unanimously voted to remove Richard from his position and to implement new policies preventing similar abuse of authority. They also established clear guidelines for property rights protection and complaint procedures. "We want to make it absolutely clear," Margaret continued, "that private property rights will be respected in this community. No board member has the authority to override legal property access or to demand keys to private gates or facilities." The meeting concluded with a formal apology to me and a commitment to review all violation notices filed during Richard's tenure. Several of the complaints against various residents were found to be baseless and were officially dismissed. Richard's legal troubles were just beginning. The district attorney's office charged him with attempted breaking and entering, harassment, and abuse of authority. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, violation notices, witness statements, and his own recorded admissions created an airtight case.